the Museum of Humanity's Final War. I'm not going to tell you much about myself. I won't recount my life story here, if only because it isn't relevant. Suffice to say, I'm an ordinary guy with a well-paid but uninteresting job, a job that allows me to pursue my two passions in life, traveling and history. From a young age, I've always been fascinated with history, and particularly military history, having studied the subject in school and college. As an adult, I continued to devour books while using my downtime to visit museums and former battlefields across the globe. I've been everywhere from the beaches of Normandy to the jungles of Southeast Asia, and have visited institutions as diverse as the Imperial War Museum in London to the Military Museum of the Chinese People's Revolution in Beijing. Some may call it a morbid fascination with death and destruction, but I have a great admiration and respect for those men and women who fought so hard and often gave their lives for causes they held so dear, and I believe their sacrifices should be remembered. Likewise, I'm a great believer in the old adage, a generation which ignores history has no past and no future. In addition to my travels, I'm also a member of several online forums and groups, along with other military history enthusiasts from various parts of the world. Our aim is not only to engage in lively debate, but also to exchange knowledge and finds. You see, there are many small and obscure military museums dotted across the globe, linked to battles and conflicts which few people are aware of. Often, these small part-time exhibits are run down and of poor quality, but sometimes we'll find hidden gems telling stories that never made it into the history books. It's finds such as these that we share on the forums for the benefit of our fellow members. It was through one of these threads that I first heard of the Museum of Humanity's Final War. This institution has no online presence or listed phone number and is not funded by a federal or state grant. What's more, no one in our group knew what the museum's exhibits consisted of. The name itself was a puzzle, suggesting a prediction of a conflict that may happen in the future. We did manage to find a physical address, but this only added to the mystery. I won't reveal the exact location of the mysterious museum for reasons that will become all too clear. Suffice to say, it's located somewhere in the American Midwest, a site one could fairly describe as the middle of nowhere. Nothing on Google Maps suggested there was a significant building in the vicinity. What's more, there were no battles or even skirmishes in the area that we could find. Nothing during the Civil War or any of the numerous conflicts with Native American tribes. All we really had to go on was a review by one anonymous poster who described his visit to the museum as a life-changing experience, and he strongly recommended a trip to the institution. The whole thing sounded pretty suspicious, and most of the group members wrote it off as a hoax. However, I was still intrigued by the mystery, and as luck would have it, I was due to attend a work conference in a city about 2 hours' drive from the location. I had a day to kill before my flight home, so I decided to make the trip. I realized it might be a wild goose chase, but reckoned it was worth taking the chance, just in case I would find a hidden gem. Never in my worst nightmares could I have imagined what I would actually encounter. The drive out that morning was uneventful as I exited the city heading west, soon leaving behind the leafy suburbs before zooming past mile after mile of flat farmland. Following my sat-nav, I left the interstate and found myself driving along a poorly maintained and near-abandoned back road. The farther I got from civilization, the less confident I felt about finding anything of significance out here. In the back of beyond, my heart sank when I reached the location and found nothing but a long-abandoned gas station, with rusty old pumps and a vandalized forecourt. Its glass frontage smashed and interior gutted. I felt like such a fool, having driven all this way for nothing. Nevertheless, I decided to get out of my rental car and take a stroll around the decrepit structure, just on the off chance I would find something of interest. This was when I saw him, a solitary figure emerging from the crumbling forecourt and walking in my direction, with a wide yet somehow sinister smile etched across his lips. I took a step back as he approached, his hand outstretched. He was an odd-looking individual, dressed in a tweed jacket and tight-fitting waistcoat, and sporting a tidy grey beard and smartly framed spectacles. His wide smile looked put on, and there was a glint in his deep blue eyes which suggested a barely concealed malice. All in all, the man had an unusual appearance, although outwardly he didn't look much different from other eccentric academic types you'd expect to find in offbeat institutions. Nevertheless, there was something off about him which put me on edge. He didn't appear to pick up on my discomfort, however, as he continued to hold out his hand, while speaking to me in a soft but clearly audible voice. "Good morning, sir. It's my pleasure to meet you. I trust your journey here wasn't too taxing." I didn't want to shake his hand, but felt obligated to do so. His grip was tight, and his palm ice-cold. I didn't quite know what to say, so I muttered my reply. No, it was fine, thanks." "Oh, that is good to hear," the man responded, enthusiastically, after he eventually released my hand. "Well, sir, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the Museum of Humanity's Final War. I am the curator of this establishment, and it will be my honor to act as your guide for this morning's tour." I was utterly confused by this point, with a number of questions running through my head. I asked the most obvious, "But there is no museum here, is there?" The curator sniggered ever so slightly before replying, "Actually, there is, sir. Although I do understand your confusion. Our institution is in fact located below ground, underneath our feet. We find it's better this way, to keep our institution off the map." This explanation only confused me more. "I don't understand. Why wouldn't you want people to know about this place? Don't you want to encourage more visitors?" The curator laughed in a dismissive, almost mocking manner. "Well, sir, we are not the type of institution that wishes to draw in the masses. We certainly wouldn't want buses full of tourists out here, would we? No, sir, we prefer to appeal directly to connoisseurs of conflict such as yourself, those who are willing to make the extra effort to seek us out." "Okay," I said uncomfortably. The whole situation raised a lot of red flags, and I was seriously beginning to question my decision to come out here alone. Granted, the curator didn't look like the type who would shoot me in the head so he could steal my car and wallet. Nevertheless, the entire situation was very unnerving. There was no way he could have known I was coming today, so why was the man standing out here waiting for me? It didn't make any sense. He seemed to pick up on my discomfort, however, speaking to me in a more sympathetic tone. "I can tell you have your doubts, sir. This is understandable. Our little museum is rather unconventional after all. However, I promise that all your questions will be answered during the tour. Now, would you care to accompany me to the elevator?" "What now?" I said with surprise. "Don't I need to buy a ticket? And aren't there any other guests coming?" The curator smiled thinly whilst shaking his head. "We don't charge an admission fee, and I prefer to give one-to-one tours. Much more personal, don't you think? Now shall we?" At that he turned his back on me and started walking towards the gas station forecourt. I had a decision to make in that moment. I could either turn heels and run back to my car, or I could follow this mysterious man and see where he would lead me. I know what I should have done, but I still felt drawn to the mystery. Curiosity can be a dangerous thing, and I let it get the better of me on that day. I followed him past the disused gas pumps and into the smashed-up forecourt, almost tripping over the trash and assorted debris. This wasn't like the entrance to any museum I'd ever visited before. What drew my attention, however, was the elevator door, located at the rear end of the decrepit building. It looked like it had been newly installed at considerable expense. Stainless steel with a digital floor display and buttons lit up and ready to push. The curator summoned the elevator, and I watched as the doors slid open. "After you, sir," the curator said, whilst gesturing towards the waiting lift. I hesitated for just a second before stepping forward, feeling more than a little uneasy as the curator followed me inside, and the door slammed shut. I don't know how far the elevator descended into the guts of the earth, but it seemed like we were going down for an eternity. Throughout the descent, the curator stood perfectly still, his smile gone, as he glared straight at me with deadpan eyes. I felt nervous in that moment, as I feared the curator would lash out with the intention of doing me physical harm. I thought I might need to defend myself, but he never moved a muscle. I felt relief when the elevator finally reached the lower floor, and the doors opened with a ping, but of course, I had no idea of what lay before me. We exited the lift, and the curator led me down a long concrete corridor. I realized how exposed I really was down there, as my heart beat faster and I began to sweat heavily. "What is this place?" I asked nervously. The curator answered without turning to face me. "A former government installation that we acquired for our purposes." A government installation. I had images of a former missile silo or fallout shelter. This only added to the mystery and to my apprehension. Finally, we reached the end of the corridor and found a security door blocking our path. The curator typed a code into a keypad, opening it and inviting me inside. When I stepped through those doors, I couldn't believe what I saw. A vast subterranean chamber, its ceiling at least 60 foot high, and with a length about the size of 2 football fields. And the vast bunker was filled with military hardware and weapons, big screens displaying footage, and so many exhibits behind perspex glass. It was a literal treasure trove of military history, making for one of the most impressive museums I'd ever seen. The only thing missing was a gift shop. I was truly astonished by what I saw before me, as I walked forward in a state of awestruck wonder, only for the curator to stop me in my tracks, as he placed an ice-cold hand on my shoulder and whispered in my ear. "Please, sir, I must insist that we stick to the official tour." "I don't understand," I responded. "How did you get all this hardware?" "All will be revealed, sir. You just need to be patient. Now, shall we begin?" I nodded my head and submitted to his wishes. He led me to the first exhibit, the sign above the cordoned-off section, reading "The Beginning." The curator began to speak in an authoritative tone of voice. "What is war if not an act of conquest? And conquest is merely the exploitation of weakness." The time before the final war was one of decay, both moral and physical. Human civilization had reached its nadir during the first half of the 21st century, an inevitable result of corruption, conflict, terrorism, pandemics, greed, and environmental destruction. All this meant the time was ripe for the enemies of humanity to make their move. The enemies of humanity. This expression puzzled me, but I stayed silent for the time being, hoping to find out more. And of course, we played our role in promoting chaos, using fifth columnists to spread fear and hatred. He motioned me towards a big screen, which suddenly burst to life. The screen displayed CCTV footage of an office complex divided up into cubicles, with workers sitting and staring at monitors. A second later, a lone gunman armed with an assault rifle burst into the building, firing without mercy at the unarmed workers, hunting them through the complex while reloading. slaughtering at least a dozen people before moving off screen, leaving blood and corpses on the floor behind him. The next piece of footage showed a man in a heavy coat entering what looked like a place of worship, with parishioners kneeling in prayer along the pews. The man walked halfway up the aisle before he was noticed, suddenly discarding his heavy coat to reveal a bomb strapped to his chest. Before anyone could react, he detonated the device, and the camera feed was replaced by static. I found the footage of these terror attacks overly graphic and distasteful, but made no comment. Beside the video display were various exhibits behind glass, including an AR-15 assault rifle and a suicide bomber's vest, along with details of numerous other attacks, as well as various schemes to promote political division and manipulate financial markets. When I'd finished reviewing the exhibits and material, the curator led me to the next section of the museum, entitled The First Strike. No doubt you've heard of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse: conquest, war, famine, and death. Well, horsemen are a bit old-fashioned for this modern age, and so instead we recruited 4 pilots, sleeper agents, trusted and respected after long and illustrious careers, the last people who would be suspected. When activated, our pilots took control of 4 flights, simultaneously coordinating 2 mid-air collisions, killing hundreds and spreading fear and confusion throughout the world. He switched on a video of news footage showing explosions in the sky and debris falling to the earth. I racked my brains but couldn't recall such a terror attack, although I noted there were similarities to the September 11th atrocity. "It's a terrible thing," I said, "but we've seen terror attacks like this before. How is this one any worse?" The curator nodded his head, smiling ever so slightly as he answered. "What mattered is not the number of casualties, but the people who died. One of the planes carried the Secretary General of the UN, the second held the wealthiest tech billionaire in the world, the third transported the head of the Roman Church, and the fourth, that was Air Force One, killing the US President and most of his senior staff." "I see," I replied, barely suppressing a smirk. I reckoned I would have remembered if the President and the Pope had been killed by terrorists on the same day. Obviously, this was all fake, but why would anyone go to such efforts? I thought about it for a moment, noting the great cost which must have gone into converting this space, and the high production values of the news footage and videos displayed. I reckoned a big Hollywood studio must be involved, and perhaps all this was to promote a new blockbuster movie. Maybe they were filming me right now, waiting to see my reaction. This was the only logical explanation I could think of, and so I decided to play along and see what happened. The curator talked me through the rest of the exhibit, which included debris from the downed planes and profiles of the victims. And then we moved on to the next area, entitled Shock and Awe. "The end of the world begins in a suitably climatic fashion," the curator continued, "with seemingly natural disasters of unprecedented ferocity. Earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, tsunamis. Thousands will die in a few short hours, but this is only the beginning." He motioned me towards a screen showing footage of devastated city streets, mass floods washing away acres of farmland, and lines of thousands of refugees fleeing from disaster areas. Next, the news showed aerial shots of huge and deep sinkholes, dozens of them spread across fault lines on each and every continent. The newsreaders explained how each hole was hundreds of feet wide and of unknown depth, and all the experts interviewed were baffled by their sudden appearance. As I watched the footage, the curator whispered in my ear, offering an explanation with just 2 chilling words: hellmouths. The next screen showed what appeared to be satellite footage of one of the sinkholes. I was astonished to see dozens and then hundreds of what I could only describe as balls of fire emerging from the hole and firing in every direction, a wall of flame unlike anything I'd ever witnessed before. A narrator spoke over the footage in a monotone voice, explaining how each fireball was the size of an automobile, and how they appeared to be guided by an unknown power, each with its own specific target. "There are 1,000 sinkholes across the globe," the curator added, "and thousands of fireballs emerge from each one, meaning millions of coordinated strikes upon every nation-state on the planet." More clips followed, and it became clear that the fireballs were virtually unstoppable. In one scene, a surface-to-air missile was fired, but simply passed through the flaming orb, not even diverting it from its course. The next clip showed a squadron of F-22 Raptors flying in formation, all suddenly being struck in mid-air, blown to smithereens before either their pilots or automated defense systems could react. The footage switched to iconic buildings across the world: the White House, Pentagon, Westminster, the Kremlin, and the Great Hall of the People, to name but a few. They were all in flames, burning to the ground after multiple strikes. I had to admit that it all looked very realistic, even if the destruction of famous landmarks is something of a disaster movie cliché. Alongside the big screens, there were a number of props on display, including the charred remains of the Resolute desk, normally found in the Oval Office. "The shock and awe offensive was a success," the curator continued, "crippling global governments and military commands. The scene is set for the commencement of the ground campaign." He then led me to the next exhibit, simply called Invasion. This was the largest section of the museum so far, and what I saw in there really shook me to my very core. A projection on a big screen showed a series of shocking images of carnage and death. The first showed a massive aircraft carrier on the open sea. The warship appeared to be sailing in calm seas. That was until the water around it began bubbling, as if it was boiling. A huge shadow appeared under the surface, the type which could only have been cast by a sea creature of unbelievable size. The Leviathan did not surface, but instead extended its 8 enormous tentacles, each being 40 to 50 foot thick. The tentacles tightened their deadly grip around the body of the vast warship, using immense strength to pull it downwards into the water. I watched on in awestruck horror as the aircraft carrier was turned on its side, throwing planes and helpless sailors into the boiling waters below. Next was an aerial shot of a beach, suddenly assaulted by huge serpent-like creatures that emerged from the waves, slithering across the sands towards a waiting line of soldiers and police, who attempted to mount a defense to little effect. They fired upon the snakes with rifles and pistols, but the serpents kept on coming. In a moment, they were on top of the defenders, literally devouring the men by swallowing them whole. With the defenses defeated, the monsters were free to attack the city beyond. The curator had remained silent for several minutes, letting the footage speak for itself, although he did offer a short commentary before the next scene. "Our offensive was assisted by local allies, although many of them were not exactly willing participants. To emphasize the point, I watched a film of an open plaza, which I recognized as being Tiananmen Square in Beijing. A company of Chinese troops had set up a defensive perimeter, only to be assaulted by thousands of civilians in a zombified state, screaming bloody murder as they literally threw themselves at the line of heavily armed soldiers. The troops opened fire with every weapon in their arsenal, slaughtering hundreds in a matter of minutes, but the horde kept on coming, with zombies climbing over the corpses of their comrades to reach their objective. Soon, the horde overwhelmed the soldiers, literally ripping the troops to pieces and soiling the plaza with their blood and guts. It was horrific, but there was worse to come. The next shot showed the helmet cams of soldiers moving through a forested area in the dark, using night vision to survey their surroundings. I heard them speak with one another through their headsets. They all had British accents, making me think they must be UK Special Forces, most likely from the SAS. The atmosphere was tense, and it seemed like the troops were expecting an attack or ambush at any moment. Suddenly, there was a rapid burst of movement on the path ahead, as a creature leapt upon the lead soldier before he was able to react, dragging his body into the undergrowth. The man's screams were still audible as the commander gave the order to open fire, and the screen was filled with tracer bullets and the chaos of battle. More attacks followed, with soldiers being sliced to pieces or dragged into the tree line by creatures that moved so quickly they were impossible to take down. And then the soldier with the helmet cam looked up, seeing a monster perched on a tree directly above his head. He illuminated the creature with the torch mounted on his gun, revealing what I can only describe as a werewolf, its teeth and claws razor sharp, and its eyes burning a demonic red. The soldier pulled the trigger a split second after the werewolf leapt from the tree, but it was already too late. The monster tore into him, ripping and shredding his flesh in a violent frenzy. The man screamed before his camera feed cut out. The final scene in the reel was the most shocking. The camera view showed a city street somewhere in the US, a city transformed into a war zone. A party of American troops had set up a roadblock and were facing an enemy as yet unseen. The ground shook, indicating that something huge and powerful was making its way down the street. And a moment later, it came into view. A huge demon easily 50 to 60 foot tall. It had the head of a bull, with horns and a snout filled with enormous teeth, and eyes burning as red as the sun. Its body appeared like that of a man, and its mighty legs like those of a goat, complete with cloven hooves that cracked the tarmac as the monstrosity marched along the suburban street. The soldiers opened fire with assault rifles and a machine gun mounted on top of an armored Humvee, but their bullets had no effect, merely bouncing off the beast's body, as if its hide was made of steel. Suddenly, a projectile was fired from somewhere off-screen, probably a shoulder-launched missile or RPG. The projectile struck the demon in its torso, causing the beast to roar aloud in pain and anger. The monster reacted by pulling a weapon from its sheath, a sword made of fire and at least the length of 2 men. With one mighty sweep, it took out a dozen soldiers, literally cutting them in two, smearing the street with their guts and internal organs. Men screamed as the demon used his sword to smash through the roof of the Humvee before it continued its thumping advance down the blood-strewn street. A moment later, another 2 demons, both as large and strong as their leader, marched into the shot, finishing off any survivors with their swords, or by crushing them underneath their hooves. There were many other scenes of brutal atrocities and monsters stalking the earth, but as hard-hitting as the footage had been, it was nothing compared to the exhibits located in this section of the museum. The curator directed me towards a group of dummy soldiers behind the glass. A dozen troops from different armies, American, Russian, Chinese, Indian, and others, all dressed in their national combat uniforms and with assault rifles pinned to their chests. It was only on closer inspection that I realized it wasn't plastic mannequins dressed up in uniform, but rather mummified corpses, dead men with discolored skin, their eyes removed and empty sockets staring out at me. The bodies were frighteningly realistic and totally grotesque. I looked to the curator for an explanation, but he merely shrugged his shoulders before answering. I would like to say they fought bravely, but the truth is, most of humanity's armies were crushed in a matter of days. I shook my head in disbelief, astonished at the lengths they'd gone to. Still mesmerized, I wandered through the rest of the exhibits as the curator patiently waited for me to finish. Above my head, hanging from the ceiling, was the fuselage of a 35 Lightning jet. One of its wings had been shot off, but otherwise it was nearly intact. I looked to its smashed-up cockpit and noted that the charred remains of the pilot were still inside. Below the aircraft sat a Russian T-14 Armata tank, with a huge hole clearly visible through the top of its turret, making it look like a pierced tin can. There were many more vehicles and weapons on display, state-of-the-art military hardware that would have cost millions to manufacture and maintain, now reduced to useless pieces of junk. It was an extraordinary yet horrifying sight to behold, and I began to question the motives of whoever had set this all up. When I finished my review, the curator pointed me to another big screen and offered me further narrative. The surviving remnants of Earth's political and military leaders holed themselves up in their bunkers. During the final days, desperate and out of options, they authorized nuclear strikes against our hellmouths, hoping they could halt the invasion. But alas, they only succeeded in killing millions of their own people, whilst hastening the destruction of the planet. The screen showed footage of ICBM strikes, of nuclear detonations brighter than the sun, mushroom clouds ascending into the skies, and of devastated landscapes with entire cities reduced to ruins and rubble. A map came up which showed the locations of the nuclear strikes, dotted all across the globe. The result of these coordinated attacks would surely be cataclysmic. The curator allowed me time to take it all in before leading me to the next and penultimate section, entitled The Spoils of War. With victory now assured, the time had come for my master to claim what is rightfully his, namely, the bodies and souls of the conquered. He led me through a grotesque display of severed human heads, somehow preserved and mounted upon spikes behind perspex glass, their dead eyes still open and staring out at me in an accusatory manner. The decapitated heads belonged to political, military, business, and religious leaders, several of whom I recognized from the news. The resemblance was uncanny, right down to the smallest of details. I walked past the macabre display, finding the whole experience extremely unnerving. I saw the curator watching me as I proceeded through the grim exhibit. I noticed he was smiling, apparently taking pleasure in my discomfort and disgust. When I was finished, he directed me towards one final screen, allowing the images to speak for themselves, and the signage above read, "A World Transformed." The video showed clips of devastated and lifeless landscapes, the sun blocked out by a thick cloud of radioactive dust. Next came the image of a huge demon standing over a party of defeated prisoners, laughing cruelly as it used its fiery sword to slice the POWs into pieces. And finally, the horrifying footage of a line of emaciated refugees slowly marching across a dead land, men, women, and children, many showing the signs of advanced radiation poisoning, their skin badly burnt, and bodies covered in cancerous tumors. They were totally defeated, their heads down as they trudged forward to an unknown destination. Several fell down to the mud, so weak that they couldn't go on, and their fellow refugees made no effort to help the victims, instead continuing with their grim death march to nowhere. I felt physically sick after watching these horrific scenes, and it took me a moment to compose myself and come back to reality. Everything I'd seen, all he'd exposed me to, it all seemed so real, but I had to remind myself that it couldn't possibly be. I turned back to the curator, who stood silent by my side, meaning to challenge him and expose his sick charade. "Well, sir," I began, "this is quite the show you've put on today. Obviously, you've gone to great effort and expense, but I reckon it's time you told me the truth. What's the real story here? What's your agenda?" The curator surprised me by responding with laughter, his loud bellow echoing off the walls. "Honestly, sir, Even after all you've seen and heard, you still don't believe." "Of course I don't," I snorted in disbelief. "None of the events you've shown me have happened in the real world." "They haven't happened yet," he replied, coyly. "What you have seen is the future. This is humanity's destiny." Now it was my turn to laugh. "Ridiculous," I exclaimed. "Do you take me for a damn fool?" The curator smiled, and I noted a malicious glint in his eye. "Well, sir, I can see you're the cynical type, but don't worry. We have a special private exhibit for persons such as yourself, for those who require indisputable proof. If you care to follow me to the annex." He led me to the far wall of the bunker, where another security door was located. He quickly typed in a code to open the door and reveal a darkened chamber within. With some trepidation, I walked forward into the darkness, noting the stench inside which reminded me of a zoo or kennels. The darkness was all-encompassing and the silence deafening. That was, until the curator turned on the lights and all hell broke loose. As I was hit by a hellish conflation of sights and sounds, so terrifying that I was forced to retreat, only to find the security door was shut, trapping me inside with these unspeakable horrors. When I eventually felt brave enough to turn around, I found myself face to face with a literal army of nightmares, monsters barely contained and as mad as hell. I saw a huge ball of fire, the same as the ones on film, now locked behind a thick glass screen. It burnt as bright as the sun as it crashed against the walls of its prison, and when I examined the fiery orb in greater detail, I swore I could see a human face within the flames, a tormented soul trapped within. On the far side of the chamber was a bloodthirsty werewolf trapped in a cage, snarling and growling as it tried to get free, its red eyes burning with hatred as its claws and teeth tore at the metal bars. Beyond the wolf sat a huge water tank containing a green-scaled serpent, at least 20 feet long. With fangs as long as steak knives, it frantically circled the tank, splashing murky water against the glass. And last but certainly not least was the monster held in chains and behind reinforced glass. At the far end of the chamber, a demon so tall its horns almost touched the ceiling. The monstrosity was nearly identical to the ones I'd seen in the videos, nearly 60 feet tall, with the head of a bull, body of a man, and cloven hooves of a goat. The demon roared as it struggled with its chains, its evil eyes focused upon me as it pulled with all its might. I cowered in the corner, terrified and fearing for my life, as I believed the monsters would break free and tear me to shreds at any moment. But the curator was in control of the creatures, and he was able to calm them with a mere click of his fingers, ending their frenzy and reducing the monsters to a docile state. I shook my head in disbelief, the cold sweat dripping from my forehead as I muttered my next words in a state of shock. "It's all real." "Yes," the curator replied firmly. "When will it happen?" I asked through shaking lips. The curator shrugged. "Whenever the conditions are right. It could be a year, or it could be 5. But rest assured, it will happen soon." I took a deep breath. A million things were racing through my mind in that moment, but there was one fear which immediately came to mind. "You're not going to let me leave this place, are you?" I asked nervously. "Because now I know the truth." The curator laughed aloud, once again. "On the contrary, sir, the tour is now over, and you are free to leave whenever you like." I was confused and suspected a trap. "But I know everything. Aren't you afraid I'll tell people what I've seen?" "Tell whoever you want," he answered with a dismissive shrug. "No one will believe you. This museum will not remain in this location, and you'll have no proof of what you saw here. At most, you'll contribute to the existing undercurrent of fear and paranoia, which will only assist in my master's plans. I shook my head in disbelief, feeling faint as the monsters continued to stare me down. Surely you don't think you'll get away with this? I demanded. Oh, I know we will, he answered confidently, the glint in his eye turning into a look of pure evil. Humanity's fate is already set in stone. The rain of fire is nigh. Now, if you'll be so kind, sir, the museum will soon be closing, and you really should be on your way. The curator was as good as his word. As he escorted me to the waiting elevator and back to my car on the surface, I was allowed to leave unmolested. He was right about another thing too. Nobody did believe my story. Not my friends, family, the other members of the forum, the cops, or even several priests I spoke with. They all thought I was crazy. The police did go out to the site, but they found no evidence of any underground chamber or elevator, and the enigmatic curator was nowhere to be seen. I've never found any solid proof to confirm my claims, but rumors persist online, with anonymous posters speaking of mysterious museums popping up in remote locations. Eastern Siberia, the Australian outback, and the mountains of Tibet have all been mentioned, but there's never anything definite. So I've come here to share my story in the sincere hope that someone will believe me. The things I've seen, the horrors revealed to me, I just can't live with them. I don't believe humanity's fate is inevitable. We must fight back, whether it be by conventional means or with the help of a higher power. We must prepare and ultimately prevail against the forces of evil, because the alternative is too awful to contemplate. There's another moon in the sky. I've always loved looking up at the night sky. The concept of space has intrigued me since I was a child. My father worked with NASA. My mum has always said that my interest in the stars had been passed down genetically. When I was just a boy, my father had purchased a recreational telescope for me. I can remember spending hours just staring up into the sky, watching the moon drift across the black canvas of space. I used to tell my friends that I would have taken the offer to live on Mars, no matter where or when it was that I'd been asked. Just the thought of being included in the construction of a successful Martian colony was enough to get me excited. My girlfriend, Haley, tries to match my enthusiasm, but it's not hard to tell that she doesn't care nearly as much as I do. I don't blame her, obviously. Space, like the open ocean, can be a scary thought for some. A few days ago, Haley and I had been out on a walk around her small Tennessean neighborhood. Every now and then, the two of us would go on midnight walks together. Haley would talk to me about her own interests, while I tried my best to teach her about our sky. I know that's the Big Dipper, she said, pointing up at the sky. I smiled. Yeah, now you're getting it, I said, laughing. And, there's the moon, she said, pointing over her shoulder behind us. I laughed once more. All right, Haley, you can stop acting like you care now. Haley smiled politely. It's not that I don't care, Jay. You know that, she said, kicking a rock that sat in the middle of the sidewalk. I just can never wrap my head around all that stuff, in the way that you can, you know. I nodded. I'm just messing with you, Haley, I said, putting my arm around her shoulder. Good, she said, leaning against me. Because maybe I did want to move on from the space talk. I laughed. All right. What do you want to talk about? Haley hummed. Well, we can talk about the trip. I sighed, looking down at my feet. We don't have to, though. Haley slowed down, turning towards me. Jay, you have to meet my parents sooner or later. It's been almost a year, she said, smiling. I wouldn't force this on just any boy. You know. I know, I said, groaning. I'm just worried your parents won't approve of me. Plus, we should just wait until after this virus thing is done, right? Why risk getting sick? Haley laughed. They'll love you, she said, starting to walk again. Plus, even if they don't, who cares? I'm an adult. I'll just love you enough for the both of them. I smiled, following beside her. If you say so, I said, returning my arm to her shoulder. Haley giggled, looking up into the sky. You know, if we have time tonight, we should, she said, trailing off. She stopped abruptly, frowning. What the fuck is that? I squinted my eyes, looking up into the sky. I could see the glow of Polaris from hundreds of light years away. The moon sat in the night sky in front of us, its bright white face staring back at me. I laughed. I started, suddenly realizing what was wrong. My head spun over my shoulder, looking back up into the sky. The real moon was right where I'd last seen it, hovering out in space behind us. My eyes moved back towards the imposter. I was shocked I could have even mistaken it for our moon. The circle was almost entirely white. No craters could be seen on its surface. In fact, it appeared slightly larger than our own moon. I have no idea, I said. My heart started to pound faster. I was both ridiculous curious and terrified at the same time. Haley stammered as she spoke. Let's just get back to the house, okay? This is freaking me out. The two of us walked quickly back to her house. Haley's eyes remained glued to the ground, while my own never left the new moon. I'd never seen anything like it before. Haley had started to panic only when we'd entered the house. What the fuck is that thing? I held up my hands, eyeing the imposter moon through Haley's window. Calm down, Haley. I'm sure there's an explanation for this. Haley looked like she was going to start crying. You don't know that, Jay, she said, freaking out. What if it's like aliens? I couldn't help but laugh. Baby, why would aliens put another moon in our sky? Haley stared back at me for a few seconds before shrugging. How am I supposed to know? What else am I supposed to think? I sighed, slipping my cell phone from my pocket. Here, I'll call my dad, I said, smiling at her. Maybe he'll have an explanation for this. Haley shook her head, mumbling. How can you be so calm? I didn't reply. In reality, I was freaking the fuck out too. I had no logical explanation for what was resting in our sky. My fingers pressed against my phone screen, my father's name eventually flashing across the screen. My father had been retired for several years now, but I was sure he'd have a better understanding, an explanation, than I ever could. My father finally picked up the phone. He sounded tired. James, is everything all right? I laughed nervously. Yeah, no, everything is fine. I just had a quick question. My father groaned. It's nearly 1 a.m, he said. I could hear my mother speaking in the background, as my father began to quiet her down. I know, I'm sorry, I said, scratching the back of my neck. It's important. Well, what is it then? My father asked. Can you go outside for me? I asked, anxious. I didn't know what to tell him. What? He asked, sounding appalled. Why? Just trust me, I said, looking back through the window. The imposter moon had not moved an inch since I'd last seen it. My father began to mumble through the other end of the phone. After a minute of quiet, I could hear my father open his front door. All right, I'm outside. I nodded slowly, waiting for his response. Well, I asked, confused. Well, what? My father responded. What are you talking about? You don't see it, I asked, noting Haley's visible confusion. Jesus, James, my father said, sounding angry. Just spit it out already. It's too early for games, I stammered. You don't see the second moon, my father scoffed. The what? He said. Is there something wrong with the moon? I hung up the phone without answering. I pulled open my camera app, stepping up to the window. What did he say? Haley asked. I ignored her, snapping a clear photo of the imposter moon. I clicked on my father's name once more, sending the photo his way. I waited a few moments, watching as my father began to type in response. What the hell am I supposed to be looking at, James? He couldn't see it. Why couldn't he see it? He doesn't know what it is, I said, staring at the new moon. Haley was visibly distressed. Oh my God. I crossed the room, taking her into my arms. It's okay, Haley. I'm sure someone will figure something out soon. Haley asked me to sleep with her that night. She didn't want to be left alone. I, of course, obliged. I didn't have any real reason to get home tonight. Anyways, the next morning, I woke to find Haley still fast asleep beside me. I was glad she'd been able to sleep well, despite the new addition to our night sky, the moon. I pushed myself slowly from Haley's bed, careful not to wake her. My legs carried me to Haley's front door, the sun warming me as I stepped outside. My eyes moved to the sky. What was it that we'd seen last night? Where had it gone? I'd started to ask myself these questions far too soon. My eyes landed upon the imposter moon, the sphere resting in the sky in exactly the same spot it had been the night before. I walked out into the street. The imposter moon had remained in the same spot throughout the entire night. How was that even physically possible? I heard what sounded like someone talking somewhere behind me. Already on edge, I spun around, scanning the street. No one was there. I said beautiful, isn't it? The voice repeated. I looked up. A man looked down at me from the roof of his 3-story home. His legs dangled over the edge of his roof. I blinked, taken aback. Oh yeah, I suppose it is, I said, backing up. What are you doing up there? The man looked up into the sky. I'm not sure, he said, swinging his legs. I just felt the urge to get closer. I nodded. Closer to the moon? The man grunted in agreement. Not sure how to explain it. Do you have any idea what it is? I asked, looking back to the new moon. It's beautiful, the man said, looking back down at me. Is that what you mean? I sighed, turning towards Haley's house. Thanks for your help, I mumbled softly, my anxiety returning. The man didn't respond. His eyes returned to the moon. I felt a shiver run through me as I walked back across the street. The man hadn't seemed to be entirely there, mentally. I stepped through Haley's front door. My girlfriend was standing in her living room, looking out the window. How'd you sleep? I asked, causing her to jump. Jesus, she said, turning back to me. Don't scare me like that. I frowned, sighing. Are you okay, Haley? Haley chewed her lip. I'm sorry, Jay. I'm fine, she said, returning her attention to the imposter moon. Any news? I shook my head. I haven't heard anything, I said, sitting on her living room couch. Your neighbor across the street is sitting up on his roof right now. Haley looked back at me, confused. Who, Harrison? I shrugged. Maybe, yeah, I said, turning on the television. He never goes up there, she said, heading to the front door. I sighed, changing the channel to the local news station. The anchors seemed to be unfazed by the new moon. I watched for about a half an hour. None of them mentioned the arrival of the curious celestial body. I hadn't heard Haley come back inside. Harrison is acting really weird, she said, sitting down on the couch beside me. He says he's been staring at the moon all night. I nodded, looking through the window. The moon stared back at me. I headed home later that day. I would have happily stayed with Haley all day if I could have, but I was worried about leaving my dog at home for too long by himself. The moon remained in the same spot in the sky as I drove. I couldn't help but stare at the moon as I sat in my car. It really was beautiful. I wished I had been able to get closer to it. As I drove through town, I almost didn't notice the mobs of people standing on the rooftops. Once I'd spotted them, it was all I could see. I pulled my car over to the side of the road, watching as hundreds of people stared up at the moon. I stepped out of my car, the slamming of my door catching the attention of one man who stood near the edge of the roof. "What the hell are you all doing up there?" I asked, squinting as sunlight entered my eyes. The man shrugged, looking back towards the people around him. "I couldn't tell you. Everyone started coming up here, so I just followed them." I nodded slowly, not believing what I was hearing. "Why not just come down? We're supposed to be staying away from one another anyway." The man stared at me for a moment. "I don't think I want to," I scoffed, looking down the street. Several cars had parked on the side of the road now. A woman further down the street was trying to figure out how to get up onto the roof of a nearby shop. "I don't have any answers, pal," the man said, causing me to turn back to him. "Just stare at the moon. You'll see what I mean." I sighed, looking up at the moon. It sat in the sky, unmoving. I hated to admit it, but it was tempting. For some odd reason, I wanted to move as high up as I could. A cry from behind me caught my attention. I broke from my trance, turning over my shoulder just as a man's foot slipped from the roof of a nearby building. A gasp escaped from my throat as I stumbled off of the sidewalk, placing my hand against the roof of my car. The man's eyes remained on the sky as his head crashed hard into the pavement. His neck snapped at a horrific angle as his body crashed into his own head. Silence filled the air as bystanders ignored the scene. I felt sick. "Jesus fucking Christ," I said, forcing myself to look away. Should I try to help him? "He jumped," the man from the roof said suddenly. His eyes locked onto the moon. "He what?" I asked, looking back towards the man. No one seemed to care to help him. "He wanted to get closer," the man said, looking down at me. "He thought he could fly." I began to back up, unsettled. The man looked back up to the moon. I stepped back into my car, fear coursing through me. My shaky hands moved towards my cell phone. I had to do something. I called 911, moving the phone to my ear. I hoped the police could stop this madness. An operator didn't answer my call. I stared at my cell phone, confused. I didn't think that could even happen. Why would nobody answer my call? I began to drive, avoiding the corpse in the middle of the road. I needed to get home. There was an astounding lack of cars on the road as I drove, even with the quarantine in place. Every now and then, I felt my eyes drift towards the sky, but I never let myself look at the moon. A helicopter flew overhead. I began to feel some relief. Perhaps the police were on top of things after all. I don't know why. It's hard to remember how it happened. But I pulled my car over to the side of the road. I wanted to see the moon. I couldn't help myself. My eyes landed on the moon. It almost resembled a gigantic cue ball floating in the sky. I thought it was pretty, in an odd way. I noticed the helicopter in the sky. The vehicle was now a tiny speck of black against the blue sky. I don't think it was the police. I watched as the pilot took the helicopter higher into the sky, moving undoubtedly towards the moon. I watched in awe as it happened. Surely the pilot couldn't have expected that to work. It was impossible. Something had been clouding my mind. Only then did I realize that this was an extremely dangerous situation. I was certain I could see the helicopter falling back towards the ground as I sat back in my car. My palms had started to sweat. Was I going to die? The roads remained empty as I drove home. I found several new corpses lying on the sides of the road, all of them resting beside tall buildings. Several of the mangled bodies hardly resembled people anymore. Nothing felt real. My dog greeted me as I stepped inside my house, but I hardly reacted. I needed to call my father. "James," my father started, sounding concerned. "What was last night all about?" "Dad, you need to listen to me," I said, my hands shaking. "There's something in the sky." "James, are you all right?" my dad said, sighing loudly. "You're talking nonsense." "There's another moon in the sky," I said, looking outside my window. The imposter moon greeted me. It's making people kill themselves." "James," my father said, sounding stern, "have you fallen back into the drugs again?" I ignored my father's accusation. "I'm telling you the truth, Dad. So many people have died," I said, beginning to cry. "James, do you need Mom and I to drive down there?" he asked, a new calmness in his voice. "We are always here if you need us. Sometimes you just need to ask for help." "No," I called out. "No, please, don't come here." "I don't know what to say to you then," my father said, sighing. "There is no second moon, James. You're starting to worry me." Just tell Mum I said hello," I said, sniffling. "And that I love her," my father grunted. "Of course. Are you sure you're all right, son?" I love you, Dad," I said, hanging up the phone. I cried for a little while. I knew I had to leave town, but there was something inside of me stopping me from doing so. Any time I began to pack, I would suddenly find myself sitting on the couch, staring out the window at the moon. At one point, I'd found myself climbing a ladder on the side of my house. I had nearly reached my roof when I snapped out of it. I still don't know what brought me back. Haley called me last night. "Hey, Jay," Haley said, sounding happier than she had earlier that day. "Are you doing okay?" I asked. I'd locked myself in my bedroom, hoping that would be enough to stop me from killing myself. "I'm doing fine," Haley replied. I could almost see her playing with her hair. "Hey, Jay." "Yeah," I said. "Do you want to come watch the moon with me?" she asked, her voice raising in volume. I blinked, staring at the wall. "Are you serious, Haley?" "I mean, shouldn't I be?" she said, sounding nervous. "Haley, do not look at the moon," I said, sitting up. "You have no idea what's going on." "Okay, all right," she said, sighing. "I'm okay. I just think it's pretty, that's all." I could feel my heartbeat increase in speed. "Haley, do you need me to come over there?" "No, I'm fine, Jay," she said, laughing. "I'm fine, trust me. I won't look at the moon." "Promise me," I said, looking towards my dog. He was staring out my bedroom window. "I promise," she said, yawning. "I'm about to go to sleep anyways." "All right," I said, leaning against my pillow. "I love you, Haley." "I love you too," she replied, hanging up the phone. It hurts to say, but her response didn't sound real. Haley didn't return my calls this morning. I drove straight to her house once I'd realized what I'd done. How could I be so stupid? Harrison's body was slumped over in the middle of Haley's street, the contents of his skull resting in a pile next to it. I stepped out of my car, quickly realizing that Haley's door was wide open. I searched for hours, but I wasn't able to find her, or her body. I felt defeated. I loved her, and now she was almost certainly gone. I looked up to the moon, my hatred somehow melting into love as I stared at it. And then the moon moved. 2 gigantic eyelids began to slowly cover the sphere as the moon blinked. I don't know what is sitting up there watching us, but it isn't our friend. I only saw 3 other cars on my drive back to the house, and I had driven out maybe a half an hour while searching for Haley. I live in a fucking ghost town now, and the worst part is I can't fucking leave. I won't let myself. I need to actively force my brain not to carry me to the roof. I want to fly. When I got home, my dog slipped between my legs and out into the road as I opened the front door. I wanted to stop him, but for some reason I could only watch as he began to run down the street, his eyes locked onto that fucking thing in our sky. I don't imagine I'll be here for much longer. I just thought I'd write to you all as a warning while I was still conscious. I doubt this new moon of ours is going to just stop at my town. Good luck, and please, for the love of God, try to keep your feet on the ground. Revelation 6:8. And when he had opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth beast say, "Come and see." Revelation 6:7. I may be insane, but I feel I should write this down while I still have the chance. I'm locked in my apartment, and I've barricaded the door, but I know I won't be safe here. I just have to try to get this crazy goddamn story straight in the time that I have left before he comes for me. I need to back up some. I'm Josh. Hi. 3 days ago, I was a normal person, with a normal car, normal apartment, normal life. I worked a desk job for Golden Image LLC. Stupid name, right? We were a small image consulting firm specializing in political appearance management. In other words, when a politician fucked something up and fell out of favor, he would come to us, and we'd make the public forget how shitty he was at his job. And recently, what with the war and these Midwest droughts, business was going great. It was dull work, but it kept the bills paid, so I didn't complain much. And then all this started just a few days ago, specifically while I was riding the bus to work, like I always do. It's about a 30-minute commute to the office, and sure, it smells funny, but I've always loved watching the other passengers. You never see a cross-section of Americana quite as interesting as when you're on the public transportation system. Anyway, that was when I saw him for the first time. At first, it didn't seem that unusual. I was just sitting there ignoring the urine smell, looking at the other passengers. Man with the ponytail, mullet woman, and Mr. I don't need to wear a shirt in public were all present. The driver had his typical 1,000-yard stare, and seated towards the back there was a woman who was a regular like me. I don't know where she rode the bus to, but she was on it almost every day at the same times as me. I remember she looked a little under the weather that morning. Her hair was disheveled, her eyes watery, and I saw about 1 million tissues overflowing from the massive floral handbag she always carried. But hey, it was flu season. I didn't think anything of it other than to remind myself to use some hand sanitizer once I was off the bus. What did catch my eye, however, was the man standing in the row behind her. He was wearing a black suit, and I mean it was all black. Black jacket, black shirt, black shoes, black leather gloves, neat black hair, irises so black they were indistinguishable from the pupils. The only thing that wasn't black about him was the pale, sallow skin on his face and neck, which was white as a corpse. And this guy just stood there, staring at the woman with the floral handbag. It wasn't the normal bus pervert leer, but a simple, steady gaze of what could have been mild curiosity that was somehow more disturbing than any sexual advance. Despite not being the object of his unsettling attentions, I think I was more freaked out than the woman. She was ignoring him like a champ, and for that matter, so was everyone else on board. So eventually I followed their lead. Mr. Black was definitely a creepy character, but I'd seen worse. Welcome to public transportation. Work was pretty typical. 8 hours of familiar monotony in your average mid-American office, complete with artificial ferns and buzzing fluorescents. The only breaks from normality were that we were all a little disorganized that day, since Dave the receptionist was out sick, and me getting a random text from Sean, an old friend from college, who I had deliberately lost touch with. "You seen the news?" Weird question. The answer was no. I hadn't watched the news since the war broke out, and I didn't particularly want to have a discussion about it during work, so I deleted the message without answering. The other big event of the day was during lunch. My friend Michael from accounting talked me into finally asking out Rachel, the cute new girl, after work. I'd been keeping an eye on her for a while, but it was time to make my move, so once the shift ended, I gathered my courage and bumped into her as she was headed out the door. "Oh, hey," she said, or something like it. "You headed out?" "Just about," I replied, suave as hell. "I just got to drop these papers in the boss's office and then I'll be gone." "Cool, I can't wait to get home myself. Maybe some tea will help with this head cold," she said. "Yeah, maybe." Awkward pause. "Hey, do you maybe want to get some coffee or something? With me, I mean. Say, after work tomorrow," I asked. "And God help me," she smiled, and it lit up the room. "Yeah," she said. "That sounds cool." I smiled too. Cool. After another, less awkward moment, we said our goodbyes and went our separate ways. I dropped off the papers and paused by the window in the boss's office to admire her as she walked across the twilight parking lot to her car. And something caught my eye. On the other side of the parking lot, half in shadow but still unmistakable, stood the man in black from the bus. I'd be lying if I said that didn't freak me out. If seeing him twice in a day was a coincidence, it was a hell of a strange one. Rachel didn't seem to notice him, but from where I stood it was clear that he was watching her, not just in passing, but intently. I got out my phone and was ready to call 911 in case he made a move, but he never did. He just stared from the shadows as she walked to her car, fumbled the keys a little, got in and drove off, and then he turned and walked away. What do you do in a situation like that? Maybe I should have called Rachel and told her what I saw, but at the time I thought the guy was probably harmless, if a little creepy. The rationale of, "There's no point in worrying her and making myself sound crazy," seemed awfully rational. In the end, I decided to pretend it never happened. I dropped the papers on the boss's desk and caught the bus home. At the time, it didn't even strike me as unusual that the woman with the floral handbag wasn't on it this time. I had one missed call and one new message when I woke up the next day. The call was from work. I figured they probably wanted me to come in early, but I was already late, so that wasn't going to happen. The message was from Sean. "You seeing this?" Weird. I didn't know what he kept texting me about. And if I weren't running late, I might have replied, but the fact is, I hadn't talked to him in years. It was easier to ignore him. I remember feeling strange as I got ready that day. There was this persistent, prickling sensation on the back of my neck, and my heart would flutter nervously at odd moments. It wasn't anything serious, all things considered, just more of a general sense of unease than I was used to feeling while I brushed my teeth. I think it was because of the weird dreams I had the night before. They were the confusing, frightening kind that you can almost never remember, not that you'd want to. In the end, I just decided to put the nightmares and the anxiety out of my mind. It was probably nothing anyway, right? Still, I caught myself several times on the way to the bus stop, glancing back over my shoulder, convinced that I had seen a figure dressed all in black from the corner of my eye. As I got off the bus and walked the last block to the office, I idly wondered what it was that Sean was so eager to talk to me about. Normally, I would have asked the bus driver what he might have meant, since he was usually pretty up to date on current events, and we discussed them from time to time. But there was an unfamiliar man driving today. When I asked him what had happened to the usual driver, he shrugged. "Flu season," he said. I was snapped out of my reverie by the police surrounding my office building. Sir, you can't go in there," one of the officers said. "What? Why not?" "What's going on?" I asked, confused. Had I walked to the wrong building by mistake? No, doubtful. I'd walked this way 1,000 times. "I'm sorry, sir. We're not supposed to say. Just go home for now and wait for more information." "Please, officer, I don't understand. This is where I work. Can you please just tell me?" "Look, buddy," he said. "What did I just say? Work's cancelled today. Fuck off." So rebuffed, mind racing, and for lack of a better thing to do, I turned and started walking back to the bus stop, pulling out my phone as I did. I dialed Michael from accounting's number. It rang a good 7 times before he answered. "Hello?" His voice sounded hoarse, but maybe it was just the connection. "Mike, what's going on, man? The office is surrounded by cops, and they won't let me in. What happened?" There was a pause. "You're serious? You didn't hear?" "Hear what?" This was doing nothing to calm my nerves. "Jesus, man," he breathed, his voice grave. "You've got to start answering your phone. Are you sitting down?" I was a little panicked by now. "Fuck, dude, would you just tell me what's going on?" There was another pause, and Michael's voice cracked when he next spoke. "Dave is dead. Rachel is in the hospital. Whatever he had wasn't the flu, and they think he spread it to her. They've shut down the building until they can be sure." He tried to continue, but I had already hung up and started running. I'm not sure why I reacted the way I did. Granted, I wasn't close to Dave, but Jesus, we worked together. I'd seen him on Monday and he was fine, and now I was supposed to believe that he had just... And Rachel. I think part of me wouldn't believe something that awful had really happened until I saw it for myself. On top of that, maybe I felt protective of Rachel and our fledgling relationship. Or maybe I took some kind of responsibility for what had happened to her. I had this awful feeling that whatever was wrong with her had something to do with the cold, black eyes that I'd seen fix on her the night before. If I had warned her about the man in black, maybe she'd have been okay. Or maybe I was cracking. Either way, I didn't stop running until I reached the hospital, 8 blocks away. People do strange things in the thrall of grief. The place was packed. When I finally burst in through the doors, as much as one can burst through automatic sliding doors, sweat-soaked and wheezing, I was actually shocked into stillness by the sheer number of people crowded into the room. Keep in mind, this was not a proper waiting room. It was an entranceway for visitors, but it was still full to bursting with sick, sniffling, coughing people trying to gain admittance. Some of them just looked a little green, others were nearly catatonic, but every one of them had this haunted look on their face, like they could break into a panic at any moment. Trying to make my way through the crowd of diseased felt like parting the Red Sea. I remember stupidly wondering if the hospital looked like this during flu season every year. After a solid 10 minutes of effort, I managed to fight my way across the room to the exhausted-looking woman behind the counter and tell her who I was looking for. "I'm sorry, sir," she sighed in a practiced response, "but none of our patients are allowed to have visitors right now. If this woman is related to you, you will be contacted once the crisis has passed. Now, for your safety, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the building." I very politely and graciously accepted her words, and then slipped past her into the hospital proper the second she looked away. Again, I'm not sure why I did this, especially since there was no plan beyond find the girl, make sure she's all right. And how did I expect to execute this plan? Simple. I was just going to check every room in the hospital until I located the one with Rachel in it. The place was massive. For 2 hours I walked from room to room, peeking inside each one, looking for her. I kept my head down and tried to look inconspicuous the whole time as an army of doctors and nurses scurried past. But I really shouldn't have bothered. Every member of the hospital staff looked harried and rushed, and in some cases on the verge of tears. They were all far too busy to stop and ask one lost, looking me where he was going. For 2 hours I looked, and I didn't see any empty beds, apart from a handful that looked freshly vacated and featured ominous reddish-brown stains. The hospital must have been far beyond capacity, and I started to fear that I would never find her in the crowd. And then I found her. God help me, I found her. I stumbled into the room where she lay, Rachel. She was the kind of girl who could make even a sickly green hospital gown look cute. She could not, however, do anything to make the blood seem appealing. It dribbled from her nose and ears. It filled up her mouth and ran down her cheeks to pool on the thin pillow underneath her head. It poured out of her eyes in silent mourning of her own bloody passing. She must have panicked at the end. Her limp hands were colored red, and the sheets and her gown were covered in thickening splatters of it. I could clearly picture her trying in vain to hold the blood in, as if she could stop it by simply clamping her hands over her mouth, and then flailing in a panic when it kept coming. Rachel was still when I found her, pale, cold. It was pure luck that I happened onto her before someone came to take her away. I walked back into the hallway, and the man in black was right fucking there, walking from room to room, much as I had, focusing his black gaze on the occupants of each one just for a moment before moving on to the next. I'll be the first to admit that at this point I really lost it. I dimly recall screaming something along the lines of, "You fucking bastard, what did you do? Look what you've done to her." That got the attention of some of the nurses. "Sir, sir," they said. "Who are you yelling at?" And then, when I didn't reply, "Code it, get him restrained and to take him up to mental health." But I didn't hear them, because when I started shouting, once he knew that he'd been seen, the man in black looked up from the patient he was inspecting and fixed his eyes on me. Something clicked. Cold pierced me on a profound level, and without making any conscious decision to do so, I ran faster than I ever had in my life. I didn't spare a single thought for where I was running to, or why for that matter. There was a primal fear coursing through me, and I knew that no matter how much distance I put between myself and that thing dressed up in the suit, it would never be enough. I lost myself for a while there, but eventually I somehow ended up running back to the bus stop. They say that in times of crises, you just want to go back to what's familiar, so I guess it makes sense. I really just wanted to go home to my apartment, but when I got to the stop, there was a notice hanging from the marker. "For your safety, all public transportation has temporarily been shut down. Sorry for the inconvenience." I sighed. That made sense. I was calming down now and putting things together. It all made sense. I turned and started heading to my apartment on foot. I didn't rush. I wanted to enjoy this walk. I looked around as I walked, trying to really take the view in and retain it. There weren't very many people on the street anymore, and those that I did see were drifting along in the same dreamlike state as I was. I sighed again. The city was kind of an ugly place, really. Suddenly my phone rang and I jumped. It had been a long day already. Sean was calling me. I answered. "Holy shit, thank God you're alive," he said breathlessly, by way of greeting. I smiled a little without quite breaking into tears. "Hey Sean, I'm alive." "Shit, just thank God, man. I've been calling everyone in my contacts, and you're the only one that's answered. I haven't heard from my family in days." He sounded like he was at wit's end, poor guy. "Dude, have you seen the news?" Not recently. Fill me in. He took a deep breath. There's some kind of disease spreading all over the world, man. They're calling it a pandemic, and the fastest spreading disease in recorded history. Something to do with modern transportation. Apparently, there have been outbreaks on all 7 continents. The number of infected keeps skyrocketing. And they haven't even begun to count the, He swallowed. Could he really not even say it? Well, what are the people on the news telling us to do? Oh God, dude, most of them aren't even on the air anymore. Just these emergency broadcast screens. The ones that still are, though, they say that things don't look good. They just keep on telling us to barricade ourselves inside our homes and stay safe. He paused. I'm scared, Josh. Yeah, me too, I said, and I meant it. Okay, I'm gonna go barricade myself in now. I'll talk to you later when all this has blown over. I tried to clear my throat quietly. I didn't want Sean to hear me start coughing. Okay, just be safe, dude. You too. And I hung up and kept walking back towards home. After a minute, I smiled again, thinking to myself, I'd forgotten how much I had missed talking to Sean. So here I am, locked in my home with a fever of 102, typing my story up for whoever might get to read it. I'm sorry if it wasn't climactic enough for you, but I think the truth really is. Now, I'm pretty sure this is the part in most stories where I would express my confusion and fear of the man in black and talk about how I don't know who he is or what he wants, but honestly, meeting his gaze in the hospital like that really brought a moment of clarity for me. My eyes are open. I'm absolutely afraid of him, but I also know what he is and why he's here. And I bet that if you think really hard, you can figure it out too. Hell, he's on the news every day. I'm not sure why I took the trouble to barricade myself in, when I know full well it won't stop him. And it certainly won't stop me from hemorrhaging when the time comes. But I suppose it's in our nature to try and hold him off for as long as we can. After all, he is why we run and hide. Like I said, I may be insane, but I really believe this is the end, ladies and gentlemen. For me, and in the broader sense, it certainly feels apocalyptic. I've got that this is it sense of dread that you only get when things are really bad. I guess the only thing that still surprises me is how fast it all went down. 2 days is all it took for my life to go from normal to falling apart to over. My ego tells me it should have taken longer than that, but I suppose that's how it is for everyone. He sneaks up on you. And he's here now, with me. It's time to go. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't scared. God, look at my hands shaking. But there's no sense in fighting. If my family ever gets the chance to read this, know that I love you. I thought about you in the end, and I want you to know that. If you liked the story, please leave a subscription. Comment what video you would like to see next and share the video. It means a lot to me. We'll hear from each other soon.